Hey guys, Roger says hey. Scarlett's here, looking out the window. Wanna say hi, Scarlett? Say hi. Oh, she doesn't want to jump. Oh, there she goes. Oh, Scarlett. Oh my goodness. Yes, you're facing the wrong way though. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to be doing another Patreon request. So this video today we're going to be learning a little bit about, I guess, the history of Texas and maybe Germany too. I'm not quite sure what this video is going to be about exactly, but one of my patrons, Joni Carter, says, "Now, I know you've done a video on alternative history and I seem to be somewhat of a German connection on your channel. I thought this would be very interesting to you with some connection to the First World War, but of course on an alternative timeline, when Texas almost became a new Germany." So I guess this is going to be one of those what if scenarios. Now, I think it's absolutely fascinating to think about what could have happened in history if just a few things had happened a little differently. And I think for people who enjoy history, it's always a fascinating thing to think about the what ifs. Now, I have no idea what the what if is on this video, but I appreciate you suggesting it for me, Joni, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at it.
It's sometimes forgotten that between the periods of Texan unity with Mexico and later the United States, it had been independent for not merely a few weeks or months, but an entire decade. That's quite a bit of time for an American state, albeit a fairly large one, to remain independent, and this wasn't a relatively uneventful period either. It was a time marked by conflicts with both Mexico and the Western Comanche over claims to Texan land, a time of political dispute over the future of the Republic, and a time of cultural struggle for what Texan identity would mean. Aside from being well within the view of its American and Mexican neighbors, the Republic of Texas had also caught the attention of various spectators far overseas. The French, British, and Dutch offering official recognition to the young republic, but elsewhere in Europe an interest of a different kind was growing. Within the German Confederation, a proposition between a handful of nobles had been put forward, a plan to colonize the sparsely populated Texan Republic and beyond by facilitating large-scale migration of Germans to settle and eventually dominate the new country. An association known as the Society for the Protection of German Immigrants in Texas, also known as the Noble Society, or Adelsverein for short, would emerge, acquire large plots of land, and begin promoting migration to these domains so as to lay the foundations for a new Germany. In 1844, within 2 years of its foundation, Commissioner General of the Society, Prince Karl of Solms-Braunfels, would journey to Texas with high ambitions for the creation of a new German homeland. His task there was to inspect the recently purchased Fisher-Miller land grant, a territory deep within the Comanche sphere of influence, and although he failed to secure colonization of the area due to Comanche resistance, he established the separate colony of New Braunfels and laid additional foundations for continued German colonization there. Growing uncertain of the colonization effort's feasibility, he would resign and pass the title of Commissioner General to John O. Mosebach just months after New Braunfels' establishment. Mosebach, upon his arrival, would be greeted by one discouraging discovery after another. The would-be colony had been terribly neglected, its funds mismanaged, and the resources promised by suppliers never delivered. Mosebach, determined to make something valuable of this effort, successfully negotiated a peace treaty with the Comanche, allowing for settlement of the originally decided upon lands, so long as the Comanche could freely pass through the territory and conduct business with the Germans. However, by this point, Texas had already been annexed into the United States, making the goal of turning Texas into a new Germany far more difficult.
Yeah.
Mosebach, despite his achievements on behalf of the colonial venture, saw numerous attempts made on his life by both disgruntled settlers and rivals. The sense that his hard work was going unappreciated, as well as frustration with the incompetent management of the society, eventually led him to resign only months after signing the peace treaty with the Comanche. One last attempt was made to salvage the venture before funds were finally exhausted and management of the colonies was abandoned. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Texas became a new Germany? But before going any further, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor. From the beginning, it seemed the downfall of the effort was simply a lack of cohesion and proper planning. It's been said by some that the key issue of management stemmed from the society's founders not having had the proper backgrounds to colonize the region wisely, and had they taken on more merchants, surveyors, soldiers, and statesmen into the society, they may have had the economic, geographic, military, and political expertise to tackle this project more effectively. Instead, money was repeatedly thrown at the project in hopes that its luck might turn, but with communication between on-site colonial directors and their overseas supporters being so poorly carried out, and said directors becoming disillusioned due to an overall lack of cooperation, it's no wonder the colonial project was ultimately scrapped as it had been. But had Moisubach not been targeted by his local German rivals and continued to work as he had, or the whole venture just been better planned from the start, things could have been very different. Following Moisubach's path, post-annexation the society would remain largely unnoticed by the federal government, and German immigration to Texas would continue smoothly, leading to more land purchases and the creation of more towns. Further exploration of the region would uncover vast silver deposits which encouraged the society to invest even more. Tales of the society's success and new opportunities reached wider audiences in Europe, garnering the attention of thousands of Germans caught in the crossfires of the 1848 revolutions, just as the Mexican-American War would come to an end back in the Americas. With the now more hostile conditions of Germanic Europe and with Texan security seemingly having been reassured by the US's victory against Mexico, a massive influx of German immigrants arrived in the US, settling in the Great Lakes states and in Texas.
That's what I was wondering about, because I know that the German immigrants, I think, make up the largest immigrant population in the United States, and I know that they are kind of concentrated, like this map shows, more in the Midwest area of the country. So I was wondering, when that was going on, at the same time they're talking about bringing German immigrants over to Texas as well.
As the 1850s progress, the issue of slavery becomes a divisive issue in the United States, splitting the country evenly between the northern free states and the southern slave states. The Adelsverein Society, being located in central and southern Texas, unintentionally becomes a beacon of freedom for runaway slaves west of the Mississippi River. Many Southerners grow angry and demand their slaves be returned, citing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 as the basis of their argument. The German immigrants and the Adelsverein Society refuse and instead grant freedom to any slave that steps onto German land. This action sparks resentment and occasional skirmishes between the American Southerners and the German colonists, the latter of which would even go as far as to supply slaves with weapons and instigate slave revolts.
I'm assuming that the German section of Texas is this lighter blue area right here. I wish you could zoom in on it a little bit so I could see better, but I think the dark blue is the United States at that time, and the lighter blue would be the German colony.
The latter of which would even go as far as to supply slaves with weapons and instigate slave revolts, receiving support from liberal Germans in the North who had become a prominent component of the newly formed Republican Party. The United States would finally erupt into civil war by 1861, with its southern states forming the Confederate States of America. With Texas in the CSA, the Germans, Comanche, and freed blacks living in New Germany immediately come under fire from Texan-led Confederate forces in the region, seeking to weed out any pro-Union supporters and possible spies. This creates a new major front for the Confederacy at no expense to the Union. This front would help open up the Gulf region and eventually allow the Union to gain total control of the Mississippi. While the German colonies had long gone unrecognized by the US but were tolerated for their helping develop the frontier, their significant action in the Civil War would bring them to national attention. However, Lincoln, refusing to allow any state to secede, would see the new Germans as allies for the moment but a threat to unity in the long term, and so planned to crack down on them post-war. However, the radical Republicans in Congress, many being proudly German themselves, would sympathize with the faction and promise them control over all eastern portions of the state previously held by slave owners, much against Lincoln's wishes. These unconfirmed promises would encourage German Texans to fight even harder and fully throw their support behind the Union upon linking up with their armies. Following the war, a German-American Republic would be declared and Lincoln would move to suppress it. However, not long after, he would be assassinated and Andrew Johnson would step in as president. Johnson too would have been an opponent of secession, however lacked the support within Congress which Lincoln carried, and very soon he'd find himself struggling to maintain control of the country. New Germany would find itself in something of a standoff with federal forces still operating under executive direction, but confidence remained strong that the radical Republicans would soon hold total control, and so the Germans endured, finally achieving total recognition from radical Republican sympathizer Ulysses S. Grant once he took the presidency in 1869. Modeling itself after the United States with some European influences, the new country drafts a constitution, creates its own Congress, and allows all male citizens to run for public offices regardless of race. Fast forward to 1871 and Prussia unites Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. With mainland Germany finally united, Kaiser Wilhelm I and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck dig up the details of the society's colonial venture and begin to evaluate what its relationship to Germany should be moving forward. While Bismarck opposes the idea of having overseas possessions, preferring to instead focus German resources on domestic and European matters, Wilhelm I argues that for the sake of uniting the German people, New Germany should be annexed into Germany proper. Bismarck eventually concedes, granting that integration of New Germany would not be a traditional colonial venture, but merely an expanding of the German Empire to include yet another German state, even if it is far across the sea. The New Germans are divided on the matter. Some fully support the idea of reuniting with the fatherland for the purpose of not only securing additional resources and securities, but also to create a united empire of the German people, a desire shared by many of the liberal Germans who fled to America back in 1848. In contrast, there also existed a population who recognized colonial German-American culture as its own thing, as well as recent settlers who moved to Texas to escape Prussian domination back in Germany, or who moved from the US bringing with them a preference for American policy. That's not even mentioning the local Black and Comanche populations who would now have a say in German politics but share no ties to the German Empire. This would ultimately create a divide between the liberal pro-Empire Germans and a coalition of pro-American anti-Prussian Germans, Blacks, and Comanches, who would form something of a nativist or American party. Similar to what had occurred within the German Confederation back in Europe, the Empire would invite New Germany to join a shared customs union and propose a series of military alliances, all with the intention of gradually integrating it into the Empire. These invitations would be opposed by the rising population of nativists, encouraging the pro-unity faction to begin curtailing the political rights of Blacks, Comanches, and new immigrants, creating great tension within the state. To the north, the United States would become increasingly weary of Germany's empire establishing a solid foothold on the continent, fostering similar tensions within its own borders, but whereas the New Germans would crack down on what was considered to be American influences, the US would pressure its German descendant population to fully integrate or face persecution. The poor treatment of Germans within the US and now a very active interest on the continent would see Germany place a greater emphasis on North America, inspiring the empire to improve its navy so that it might stand a chance of enforcing its will in the region. This naval buildup attracts the ire of Britain, triggering an arms race between the two, which the Germans would attempt to defuse with a series of non-aggression pacts and treaties, but still Britain would continue to strengthen its navy just in case. Though tensions would have cooled for the moment, they would once again escalate under the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who would have adopted an aggressively expansionist foreign policy and regularly antagonized Britain. With Texas still on the fence, Wilhelm would see it as necessary to secure yet another foothold in North America to better look after and sway New Germany. Spain had become a shell of an empire, and in our world the US had moved upon its colonies come the turn of the century, but this time, things are different. Following a local war with Spain, Germany would lay claim to not only its Caribbean colonies, but the Philippine Islands, Guam, and Spanish Sahara. If the US still sought to challenge imperial rule in Cuba and Puerto Rico, it would now need to contend with a very capable and growing empire of Germany instead of the sickly Spain. If a German-American war still happened to break out over the islands, we could expect German Texas to involve itself as well, given its close proximity, finally solidifying its place at Germany's side.
The thing is, they're not giving like dates for any of this stuff, so I feel like he's not really taking into account other world events happening. Like, when is World War One? Like, for instance, so what would that have weakened Germany? Or does World War One not happen in this alternative timeline and stuff? I have some stuff to say about this towards the end. I'm just kind of holding off to kind of see where he goes with this, because I don't want to say anything yet without seeing how this plays out.
Immediately following an armistice, moves are made to further integrate New Germany into the empire, and laws are implemented recognizing only those of ethnic German descent as proper citizens, sparking domestic unrest and eventually a revolution. The German Navy begins bombarding rebel cities on the Texan coast, motivating the US to re-engage the Germans in a continuation of the war. Several pro-imperial citizens flee the chaos unfolding within Texas to Cuba and Puerto Rico, and gradually the US shifts its approach from a naval offensive to a land invasion, occupying much of the north and forging an alliance with the pro-American factions. A bombardment of the American Northeast is carried out by Germany to divert resources away from the Caribbean theater. All the while, German-American communities in the Great Lakes region launched their own uprisings in support of the Empire, and in rebellion against anti-German sentiment within the US. Realizing it could still conquer the German Caribbean at the cost of inciting further hostility within the country, a peace treaty is ultimately made to resolve conflicts quickly, Likewise, the Germans would not have been able to continue this effort much longer without leaving themselves significantly vulnerable within Europe. Cuba and Puerto Rico remain German colonies, but German naval activity in the Caribbean is heavily regulated. Following annexation of northwest Texas by the United States, New Germany is significantly reduced in size, and its demographics are significantly altered. Comancheria would be fully under US control, as would a number of the original German settlements, these areas having become hotbeds for German-American immigrants from the north. What would remain are the coastal prairies and southern plains, occupied largely by recent anti-imperial German immigrants, blacks, and German Americans escaping persecution from the US, the majority of imperial loyalists having relocated to the Caribbean. Wilhelm II is upset with the result of the war and vows revenge on America, driving him to seek alliances with other American nations, Mexico in particular. The US becomes staunchly anti-German after the war, with more violence being directed toward German Americans, driving this population to leave for the new local havens to the south. The influx of German American and plainly German refugees boosts the population of both New Germany and the colonies, fostering a clearer German American identity in the former while reinforcing anti-American sentiment in the latter. The United States becomes more imperialistic in nature, as its anti-German views, along with Germany's growing presence in North America, forces it to secure additional territories in the Caribbean and Central America. Eventually, the Great War breaks out in Europe. The United States joins the Allies in 1914 against Germany, who was able to pull Mexico and the German-American Republic into the conflict against the US. While the southern border would be secured relatively quickly, the German-American Republic being fully annexed and the Mexican invasion being repelled, additional Caribbean and Central American lands would fall under German and Mexican influence. However, Germany would still be defeated in the Great War and ultimately stripped of these territories, though Cuba and Puerto Rico would be granted total independence in the name of self-determination, a luxury not awarded to the German-American Republic, who would have come to be recognized as both politically unstable and a threat to American security. In the end, Germany itself would emerge not much better off than it had in our world. However, through all that struggle, the German settlement of Texas would have dramatically changed North America, producing two newly majority German states in the Caribbean, drastically altering the demographics of the United States by siphoning away a large number of German Americans, and forcing the US to adopt harsher colonial policies in the name of fending off a greater local threat than ever before.
Okay, so I was waiting until the end of the video. I didn't want to stop it in the middle of the video. I had a couple of thoughts, but I really wanted to see where he was going to end up with this. He actually ended up pretty close to what I thought would be kind of true in the end. That is where the US basically took over New Germany and annexed it into the United States. I actually am surprised and I know this is what if alternative history, okay, so I know this is all hypothetical stuff, but in this scenario that he laid out, I'm actually really surprised that it took that long for the United States to take over or invade, annex Texas, however it happened. I just don't think the US would have waited that long and would have basically tolerated another colonial settlement that close. I guess I just feel like the history of the US and the way it happened, I don't think the United States would have allowed Germany to have an entire, country right there. I think that they would have seen that, especially with a mix of the blacks and the tribes, the native tribes there. I don't know. I just don't think, I also don't think the distance, between Germany and that colony would have been sustainable that long either. And I just say that going on the history of how things actually happened over here, the colonies over here in the US just did not last past a certain point. Eventually the US annexed the colonies, whether they bought it with the Louisiana Purchase or they fought for it with Mexico or what have you. The US was pretty much dead set, and I think they took the Northwest from Britain. I don't know exactly how that happened, but I think there were some treaties and compromises laid out there. So I think the US was very single-minded on taking control of the territory over here as much as possible. Texas is a big state, but compared to the rest of the United States, it would be very easy for the US to go in and take that over, I feel like. The other thing with this that I found a little odd also was it was talking about Germany kind of exerting its navy to expand its colonial empire, and I don't think Germany is not really that well known for its navy from what I gather. Now I'm not an expert on it, But from what I've learned so far, I mean, they had a hard enough time during, you know, the world wars with just the Navy, you know, fighting against Britain, for instance. The idea that they would have a strong enough Navy to exert that much colonial influence around the world, and be able to, I don't know. It just didn't sit right with me, the way he was going on about some of this stuff. Now I understand this is an alternative thing, so maybe Germany would have been a little bit stronger in this alternative history and had a better Navy and all of that. And I may not know what I'm talking about. I'm just kind of learning more about the German military and the history of it with the world wars and so forth. It's just that it seems to me Germany was more focused on the land army and a little less focused on the Navy aspect of things. So it's a really interesting what if, but yeah, it actually ended the way I thought it would. I was waiting to see if he was going to keep the new Germany as an independent country over here, even up to today, and I was like, that's not going to happen. You know, I just don't think the Germany would have had the resources to be able to keep that going. Much less expand their colonial empire like he laid out here too. Especially as the US gained more and more power. Anyway, that's just my first impressions. Now, if I got anything wrong in this and my assumptions, I probably did, because I'm going off of what I'm learning currently and I don't have a full picture of it, so some of my assumptions that I just laid out might be completely wrong. And if that's so, feel free to, you know, let me know down in the comments. I think the thing with the alternative history is it's fun to kind of debate this stuff. People have different views on what could have happened and what, you know, wouldn't have happened and all of that stuff. So I don't think there's any like real right or wrong with this stuff. It's all hypothetical. But it is pretty fascinating to see how different the world could have turned out if just a couple of things, you know, was tweaked here and there. So appreciate you, Joni, for suggesting this video. It was a good one. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to hit the like button. And also a reminder to subscribe if you're new here, or if you've been watching my videos for a while and you enjoy them and you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that. I would appreciate it. We'll probably do some more of these alternative history videos in the future because, you know, it is a very interesting topic. Roger here, and I thank you guys for watching as always, and we'll see you next time.